Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling the evolution of humanism.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, going all the way back to its, 14th century roots.
Okay.
We'll be pulling from excerpts from Humanism to Neohumanism,
Yeah.
a spectrum of ideologies. And trust me, this is not going to be like your average history lesson.
Okay.
We're going to be talking about the twists and turns that led from the French Revolution all the way to events like the death of George Floyd. And we'll even touch on some really intriguing concepts like Savarkar's Hindutva and something called superhumanism.
That sounds pretty far-reaching.
Yeah, it is. But the real question that we're exploring today is simply focusing on humanity enough for the future?
Right. That's something that this material really pushes us to do.
Yeah.
To kind of look beyond just simple definitions of what is humanism, and to actually grapple with its successes and its failures, and whether it's truly serving humanity's best interests.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How does this source define humanism? And what kind of impact has it had on the world?
So the source defines humanism as basically any system that prioritizes human interests, values, and dignity. And its impact, it's been huge, actually. You think about the Renaissance, the explosion of art and science and learning.
Right.
That was really fueled by humanist thought, a
Yeah.
shift from dogma to reason that shaped the modern world.
It's interesting because that emphasis on human values isn't limited to just one specific culture or time period, right?
Yeah.
The source points out how the golden rule, treating others as you want to be treated, pops up in traditions as diverse as the Mahabharata, the Bible, and the Rig Veda.
Wow, yeah.
It's a pretty universal concept.
It is. It speaks to a shared human experience, this kind of fundamental understanding of empathy. And, moving through history, things, of course, as they always do, get more complex. We see the decline of those traditional religions and the rise of new systems of thought, like liberalism, communism, and capitalism.
But wouldn't you say that those systems kind of became their own new forms of religion in a way? They each have their own set of beliefs and values that are sometimes just as rigid as the dogmas they replaced. The source specifically mentions Soviet communism as an example. So was the collapse of the old power structures inevitable?
It's the question, right? And it becomes even more complicated when we consider how humanism itself fractured into different schools of thought in the 20th century. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, breaks it down into three main categories: liberal, socialist, and evolutionary humanism.
So each of these flavors of humanism has its own interpretation of what it means to be human.
Basically. Yeah.
Okay. So for example, liberal humanism would be focused on individual liberty, whereas socialist humanism is going to emphasize equality and the collective good.
Exactly.
And then there's evolutionary humanism. Well, the Nazis are a pretty terrifying example of where that can lead.
Yeah. And it is crucial to remember that the Nazi interpretation of evolutionary humanism with its ideas of racial superiority has been completely debunked by science.
Right.
It's a stark warning, really, about the dangers of twisting those scientific concepts to justify discriminatory ideologies.
Right.
And it brings us to another really critical development,
Wow.
the rise of majoritarian groups in the modern world.
Right. The source talks about how both liberal and socialist humanism have kind of fallen short of their ideals in many ways. And alongside that, we see the rise of these religio-national groups.
Yeah.
And they promote a very specific, often exclusionary definition of humanity, right?
Yeah.
The tragic death of George Floyd.
Yeah.
And the plight of the Uyghurs in China. They're pretty chilling reminders of what can happen when these kind of supremacist ideologies gain traction.
And this connects to kind of this larger trend that the source highlights, the link between a failing capitalist system and the rise of fascism.
Wow.
Right. So when people feel like the system isn't working for them, they're much more susceptible to these extreme ideologies that promise these simple solutions,
Right.
even if those solutions are at the expense of others.
Right. It's like that Charles de Gaulle quote that the source includes. Patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism, when hate for people other than your own comes first.
Wow.
It's a disturbingly fine line, and history has shown us how easily it can be crossed.
Yeah.
So this brings us to Savarkar and his concept of Hindutva, which is where things get particularly complex. The source explains how he distinguished Hindutva from Hinduism, basing it on shared land, ancestry, and culture.
And this is where that exclusionary aspect of his ideology starts to take shape, right? So Savarkar argued that, for example, Muslims and Christians don't fully belong because their holy lands are elsewhere.
So even though Hindutva is framed as a cultural identity, it has clear implications for who is considered in and who is out.
Exactly.
And how does this tie into his views on the caste system?
So that's where it gets even more complicated. Savarkar drew on the concept of Aryan identity.
Oh, wow.
Much like the Nazis did.
Right.
Though with a slightly different interpretation. He saw the caste system as a way of regulating bloodlines, with upper castes having superior blood.
Wow, that's it's unsettling to see those parallels with Nazi ideology, even if the manifestations are different.
Yeah.
And it's striking that he doesn't offer a concrete plan for social reform.
Yeah.
His vision of Hindutva seems more focused on defining boundaries than on addressing the real issues that were facing India at the time.
And that is a crucial point. Over time, as the source explains, Hindutva transformed into a primarily political project. It became more about exclusion than inclusion.
Right.
Which raises a significant question. Can an ideology that thrives on exclusion truly claim to be humanist in the truest sense of the word?
Right. Yeah, it's a question that makes you think about the limits of all these different types of humanism.
Yeah.
We've seen how they've often fallen short of their ideals.
Yeah.
Evolutionary humanism, with its warped view of social Darwinism, led to the horrors of Nazi Germany. Socialist humanism, while aiming for equality, ended up creating oppressive regimes like the Soviet Union.
Right.
And even liberal humanism, with its emphasis on individual freedom, it hasn't been able to prevent exploitation and inequality.
Right.
Like the 2008 recession, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It was fueled by unchecked greed within a capitalist system.
Yeah.
It makes you question whether individual liberty alone is really enough.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Is there a path forward that addresses these flaws and creates a more just and equitable world?
Well, the source presents a compelling alternative. Spiritual humanism.
Okay.
And this is where Sri P.R. Sarkar's ideas come into play.
Yeah.
And he offers a very radical perspective, I think, that challenges the traditional separation between mind and matter. He suggests that they're not separate entities, but they're interconnected expressions of a deeper, unifying consciousness.
Okay, so for our listener who isn't a physicist, how would you explain this idea of the mind and matter being connected? How does that even make sense in a practical way?
So imagine it like this. Everything in the universe, from the smallest atom to the vast galaxies, is vibrating energy. Our thoughts, emotions, even our physical bodies are all part of this really intricate web of energy. And, Sarkar's perspective actually aligns with some of the discoveries in modern physics.
Really?
Like quantum entanglement, which shows how particles can be interconnected even across vast distances.
It's fascinating how these ancient wisdom traditions and modern science seem to be converging on this idea of interconnectedness.
Yeah, definitely.
And this brings us to Sarkar's concept of Neohumanism,
Right.
which expands that circle of compassion beyond just humans to encompass all beings.
Exactly. And the source quotes Albert Einstein, who I think captures this idea so beautifully. He says, "Our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty."
Wow.
It's a call to recognize the inherent worth of all life, not just because it's useful to us, but because it simply exists.
This makes me think about that term superhumanism that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Is this kind of what it's all about?
Yeah.
Transcending our limited human-centric perspective and tapping into this higher potential within ourselves.
Think of it less like becoming superhuman in a comic book sense,
Right.
but more about expanding our consciousness to recognize our connection to the entire cosmos.
Right.
And, practices like yoga and meditation can help us cultivate this kind of expanded awareness.
So it's about recognizing that we're not just isolated individuals, but part of a larger web of life.
Yeah.
And this interconnectedness has implications for how we actually build a just and sustainable society.
Of course.
The source mentions these examples of social synthesis, interfaith marriages and cosmopolitan cities, where people from all these diverse backgrounds are living together harmoniously.
Yeah. These are glimpses of what a neo-humanist society might look like. A world where differences are actually celebrated and people can coexist and learn from each other.
It's about moving beyond those artificial barriers that divide us, right?
Absolutely.
And embracing a more inclusive and holistic view of, humanity. But it's not just about, like, warm and fuzzy feelings. It's about our very survival.
Exactly. The source quotes Sarkar, who warns that if we continue to, like, disrupt the balance of the biosphere, it'll have, dire consequences for all life, including our own. He's emphasizing that, we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. Our actions have ripple effects when we need to start acting with that understanding in mind.
So, circling back to our central question, is focusing solely on humanity enough?
The answer, based on, everything we've been talking about, seems to be a resounding no. We can't ignore this interconnectedness, and we can't ignore our responsibility to the planet. We need to move beyond that purely anthropocentric worldview and embrace a more holistic understanding of our place in the universe.
This raises another important question, though. Like, how do we even begin to shift our perspective on such a large scale? Feels like such a monumental task. Like, where do we even start?
I think that's the beauty of this deep dive, though. Like, it doesn't just present a problem, it also offers some potential solutions, The source suggests a few starting points for those of us who are, like, ready to embrace this neo-humanist perspective.
So, like, what are some tangible steps? Like, what can we actually do to kind of start shifting our mindset and our actions?
Yeah.
Because it all sounds so radical, but also incredibly inspiring at the same time.
Yeah. Well, first of all, understand the philosophy, like really dive in. The source recommends exploring Sri P.R. Sarkar's work. He really laid out a roadmap for this transition to neo-humanism.
And for our listeners who are, like, already familiar with Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, maybe it's time for a reread with these new ideas in mind.
Totally.
I bet they'll notice things they didn't pick up on before.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about challenging our preconceived notions and expanding our horizons, really, and opening ourselves up to new ways of kind of seeing the world.
As we wrap up our deep dive into humanism and its evolution, I'm left with this thought. What if the future of humanity hinges on our ability to actually transcend the very concept of humanity as we know it today?
It's a powerful thought, isn't it? What if the key to solving our biggest challenges lies in recognizing that inherent worth of all beings, human and non-human alike? Perhaps by embracing neo-humanism, we can actually create a future where all beings can thrive.
It's certainly a lot to ponder. So for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore the work of both Sri P.R. Sarkar and Yuval Noah Harari. They offer some really profound insights into the nature of humanity and our relationship with the world around us. And who knows, maybe embracing neo-humanism is the key to creating a more just, compassionate, and sustainable future for all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.